welcome. We're pleased to have you come here and join us on a rainy Friday morning, but we think it's a really good topic. We know we have a number of colleagues who are looking at us online. This is being recorded and webcast live, so we know that we have a number of additional people who are joining us and who will be sending in questions online, hopefully. So I'm Roger Mark D'Souza. I direct our programs on global sustainability and resilience here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And we're glad this morning to have an opportunity to examine a little bit more closely topics around peace after the Paris Agreement, looking at climate, conflict, and development. I know many of you are familiar with the Woodrow Wilson Center. We serve as the living memorial to President Wilson, and most recently we were voted by the University of Pennsylvania as the #1 think tank in the world for transdisciplinary research. And that is a reflection of a lot of the work that we do on our environmental change and security program, connecting these issues. So we're really happy to have that recognition in the context of the discussion that we're about to have this morning. I think many of you are familiar with some of the work that we at the Wilson Center, together with colleagues from Europe, under the support of the G7, have done connecting these issues. I hope you're familiar with a report and analysis that we've done called A New Climate for Peace. If not, there's a copy of the report out front, and if you go to newclimateforpeace.org, you'll be able to get copies of the report and what we have done subsequently to think about the implications of connecting these issues within the context of foreign assistance. One of the things that has come out of that report is a working group that has been established by the G7, that has been endorsed by the G7 foreign ministers. They've endorsed the recommendations of that working group coming out of this analysis. So you know that there's a real opportunity to think about how we're able to connect these issues in the context of foreign assistance. And this is really what we want to talk a little bit about this morning. What happens when the rubber meets the road? What are really the opportunities for implementation? And how do we think about developing that in the context of resilient planning for climate change impacts, conflict, and development. So to help us kick off that discussion this morning, we have Nick Mabey, a longtime colleague and friend. He's the chief executive and the founder director of E3G, Third Generation Environmentalism, which is a non-profit European organization dedicated to accelerating the transition to sustainable development. And I remember when we were talking to our colleagues at USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation about having Nick here, they were quite pleased that we were able to have Nick here again, because this is part of the work that we're doing in a project that we have with USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, our Resilience of Peace project. So we recognize their enthusiasm and support for hosting this discussion this morning. In the context of E3G, Nick, in addition to his management role, he works on European climate change policy, climate diplomacy, and foreign policy, looking at the security implications of climate change and resource scarcity. He was previously a senior advisor in the UK Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, leading work on national and international policy areas such as energy, climate change, countries at risk of instability, organized crime, and fisheries. And before he joined the government, he was the head of economics and development at WWF UK. So Nick, we're thrilled to have you here. Welcome again, and I'll hand it over to you for you to kick us off.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, and thanks for the opportunity to speak here. If we're going to do Penn tables, E3G is the 6th most influential environmental think tank in the world. There we are, up from 24th when we entered. So. We're getting there. But it's great to be back, and thanks for coming on a rainy Friday morning to talk about climate change. It has been a very changeable week, so it's good to hear. What I want to do is to kind of set the scene for the conversation with the other panelists, looking at what happens after 2015, what's happened in post-Paris, but also the SDGs, Sendai. A lot happened last year. A lot of things were kicked off. And looking through how that might change the ability of tackling climate change and security, and on my slide is our favorite image, which is the world as an egg on the edge of a table, because that's what climate security means for us, is we have a fragile climate system poised on the edge of instability, and the question is how much do we hit it? How do we keep that resilient? We like to say a little jeopardy in the conversation. But since Paris, I've been going around talking to colleagues in governments around Europe, in the US, in China, to see where they think the processes are, how far we've moved forward, also with think tanks and NGOs. I take responsibility for the judgments in the presentation, and at the UN, but they are informed and trying to get a feel for where we are post the G7 process, post Paris. So I'm going to reflect a bit on the outcomes and what they mean for security, reflect a bit on the last 10, 15 years of climate security and resilience work, which we've been involved in inside and outside government, and what we've been good at, what we've been failing at, and then, but really focus and leave on a discussion of what might be some of the paths forward, which I think will be the real focus of where we're going. So, and the summary, and what's circulate the slides, is that Paris made us safer but not safe, and so we need to keep that in mind, that the climate risk implied by Paris is still unmanageable by any plausible adaptation or security response. So we need to have increased mitigation in 2020, and that is a security requirement. Climate change is impacting security, and we won't go through all of these, but most of the predictions which were made about how it will impact geopolitics and security concerns and instability have come to pass, actually rather quicker than we thought, all of us who were doing this analysis 10 or 15 years ago. And I think we should reflect on that. This wasn't, it hasn't been unpredictable, that's precisely where it goes, but the broad themes and stresses and the management challenges have been relatively predictable. So, but actually, climate change is happening faster and in more extreme ways than expected. So the science, you won't see this, but science is constantly getting worse, but no one's telling you because they just rebase it. But compared to, say, when I started working on climate change, the predictions of climate change are more faster with more impacts. And sometimes, again, it can get lost because it's not the way scientists report what they do. Security responses, however, are lagging. There's been a lot of awareness, not a lot of response. We'll go into that a lot. But there are a new wave of reforms, and a lot of issues from Sendai to the SDGs, to the G7, to Paris itself, which included a very controversial issue on environmental migration in it, which was quite surprised. There was a lot more on adaptation and impacts and loss and damage than people expected in the Paris text, partly because the main negotiations were about something else. A lot of things snuck in, which people weren't watching, if you talk to the French negotiators. But actually, dealing and delivering those requires reform, which means moving. It's not just changing the current system, putting new things in the old system. We need to change the systems. And that requires political and diplomatic work. And that's what I want to finish on. And who's going to drive these reforms? Because if you don't have someone championing, you're not going to get that. So we do a lot of work on climate diplomacy and scenarios for governments and NGOs and foundations. And Paris kind of overachieved against our expectations going in, and we've been monitoring the politics for 10 years, quite detailed way. We have strong legal force and political backing of the agreement, much stronger than people expected. All countries will limit emissions. We have stronger goals, well below 2 degrees, efforts to reach 1.5, 5 yearly cycles of ambition to ratchet up a new goal of greenhouse gas neutrality, the net zero, in the second half of the century. And critically, it puts adaptation and resilience on an equal footing to mitigation. So we like to say we've now got a climate risk management regime, rather than the mitigation regime that occasionally talked about adaptation. And that's quite important, and that regime's not just the UNFCCC, it's all the other institutions that get mandates from that process and from related processes. So the regime has changed. And the regime, that shape, that geometry will last for 20 to 30 years. We spent lots of times negotiating the shape of the regime in terms of who does what. The Paris framework is durable. We will argue a lot about what we do inside it, but we won't be arguing about the shape of the regime, the hybrid top-down, bottom-up approach. And that's good, because it means we're talking about real-world things and not abstract principles like common but differentiated responsibilities. Well, what's it going to deliver? This is a graph. The purple line is a 2-degree trajectory without negative emissions, because I don't like negative emissions, over the year. We did gaming with negotiators. in 2011-12 and asked them what might be the offers. So the green triangle was business as usual in 2030. The little crosshatch piece was the best possible negotiated outcome, which negotiators gaming this together thought would be in Paris, well above the 2-degree pathway, was the best we thought could come out of Paris. The INDC offers are pretty much in the middle. So in terms of ambition for abatement, we got a kind of mid to low outcome based on the politics, but everybody underpitched, so expect people to over-deliver. China's already said it's going to over-deliver. Europe will over-deliver. Most countries will do more than they said, partly because they changed their numbers just before Paris to make them less. But we're still on a 3 to 3.5 warming trajectory, even with that over-delivery. So again, we can argue about the precise numbers, but you know, there's more work to do. But what does that mean for security? This is a scenario structure we used in our work called Degrees of Risk, and it's trying to look at how, if we're aiming for a 2-degree world, this is based on that, what are the things that might affect the outcome? And there are 2 main axes for us, or climate sensitivity, how sensitive the climate is, low or high on the y-axis, and successful or failed mitigation policies. So that can mean we agreed to do something and failed, or we failed to agree. So successful mitigation policies imply cooperation. They imply kind of global response at some level. Failed ones imply lack of global cooperation, which will extend to lack of global cooperation on resilience and security. So we're assuming these aren't 2 separate boxes. And the Paris outcome for us is kind of in that cloud. So we think climate sensitivity is higher than expected, so it's on the high side. So we can't do anything about that. It's a revealed fact of the world. And we are kind of halfway in, perhaps a bit low half into where we need to be to successful mitigation. And we characterize that with a low end of 3 degrees, if we don't breach tipping points, a high end of 5 degrees, because there are quite a high probability of systemic tipping points. But crash response. Why crash response? Because in a basic cooperative scenario, as things get revealed as being worse, we will do more mitigation and we will work together harder on security, but they will be reactive responses rather than preemptive responses. They will be quite disruptive, they will be rushed, how they work out. If cooperation holds, if the world turns to be less cooperative, if there's US-China tension dominates things, we could fall into more collapse and competition where people are scrabbling around for bits and they leave parts of the world like Africa and Middle East to just get on with it, which is, under the scenarios we're talking about here, they would not be viable towards the end of the century as for the populations there. So, so that's the way we frame it, to say what more we need to do and how we need to think about the risks. And I think the MENA migration crisis, and we'll probably come back to this, shows the complexity of the responses. We've had a 1 in 900 year drought for the last 10 years. We've got a whole set of mixed drivers for complexity, for driving instability and social unrest, but now that's turned into full-scale regional rivalry, a very poor response from Europe, which is causing huge political stresses in Europe. So the political stresses in Europe, because of the migration crisis, are undermining our ability to respond to the root causes in North Africa and the Middle East, because they're dominating, far-right parties being elected. And we're also facing the impacts of low oil prices on causing instability, which is driven partly by climate policy, on the countries that weren't destabilized as much by the current peace in the same region. So there's no sustainable security without addressing climate and resource issues in forward planning, but I can tell you from talking to people in governments, none of that is in the current plans. Basically, we will wait to burn itself out, and then we'll see what to do, but people on week-to-week planning, basically dominated by ISIL, in a hard security dynamic, and NATO is dominated by dealing with Russia on Eastern Europe. But that's normal. In this volatile world, which we expect, not just because of climate change, but because of lots of other reasons, the space for long-term preventative measures gets crowded out in the system unless you keep it there. And that is the reality of where we are. So that's the kind of, where we are now in the real world. But we have made progress. I mean, this is, I've forgotten who did this, this is the kind of people who have climate security in their security strategy. So people are aware of climate change and the impacts on security. There's a green is kind of national security threat. So a large number of countries, including China. I think India should be a slightly more green color, but they just don't tell you. They know it's a military threat, they just don't want to say it. Vulnerabilities are high. Again, this is from the insurance industry, it's Munich Re, insurance damage. Actually, Europe is one of the least at risk domestically, well, a risk around, from climate impacts, but the US has a huge proportion of global damage, but quite well insured. Asia, large amount of global damage, not very well insured. But again, these are big numbers, and people are starting to become aware of the vulnerability from extreme events. And this was a recent poll on what is your biggest risk, and climate risk came out as the biggest risk in most of the emerging economies, whereas Australia seems to be worried about ISIS. I'm not quite sure why Australia is worried about ISIS. Countries close to China are worried about China, countries close to Russia are worried about Russia, but yes, we're all worried about ISIS, and Australia is too, but a lot of people are worried about climate change. So again, that locus of who cares, for years it was like the Europeans care. Actually, Europe's probably got one of the least sophisticated and aware discussions on climate risk and impacts. We can come to that later. It's got cultural roots. But there is definitely, day to day, talking to policymakers, they know they can't get the development in place without looking at climate change in most emerging economies. It's because it's day to day for them. It's real, coupled with things like El Nino, it really makes a difference. But attention has not led to action. We worked with the UK government, whose foreign policy advisor happened to be my co-founder of E3G at the time, to get the UN Security Council debate in 2007, which is the kind of big public beginning of this. And the EU had a climate security strategy, and there were country initiatives in UK and Germany, and the US did a lot, and NATO talked about it a bit, and the EU talked about it a lot. And to be honest, apart from the US, partly because of mandates came through Congress, and there was some bit of machinery, especially in DoD, that's pretty much led to nothing operational happening on the ground anywhere, apart from a bit of equipment manufacturing, risk assessments and basing assessments in the UK. And we can come back to why that is. So awareness was there, speeches were made, initiatives were launched, strategies were written, but they didn't actually land in operations. But we've got another wave coming through. That was that first wave. We've got a new wave coming through. Sendai and now the World Humanitarian Summit. The G7 has set up extreme weather insurance, a goal for an extra 400 million people to be covered. That could be a huge risk reduction, social conflict prevention device if focused in the right way. We looked at that. It's not got as much coverage as it should do, I think. The Global Financial Stability Board is looking at systemic risk from climate change impacts and transition. We've got the SDGs, integration into all development and international public funding, and the Paris commitments. It's coming through a frame of resilience rather than security and political analysis, and that is a bit of a problem because it's framed in a very technocratic way, and those bits of resilience that require social responses and governance and therefore politics, again, seems to be slightly edited out. But again, that's it's not that it's just it's an opportunity to make sure it is done the right way. And we have the national security initiatives like the G7, State Department process integrating climate change. The EU has a global strategy review, which reports in the middle of this year. The Netherlands are running a planetary security conference process. The Swedes are looking at it. Canadians are looking at it in their foreign ministries. So again, political interest growing, capacity. If you look underneath each of these initiatives, the actual bureaucratic capacity and budgets to deliver are not there yet. So, and just other things are happening. So other people are limiting their risk, including to the political stresses caused by climate change. And the quiet movement post the Thailand floods and the 2007, the 8-9 crisis, is that the private sector is reducing its supply chains, tightening up, focusing on resilient countries. That is not good for development. That is, no, there's some really bad, but it's perfectly logical if you're a private sector actor that that's the way you limit your risk, you limit your exposure by not putting supply chains through vulnerable regions. But of course, it lowers economic activity and reduces their capacity to respond. So, but this is, there's quite a lot of work going on in the private sector, driven by consultancies and the insurance industry, producing things like this, which is the Lloyd's City Risk Index. This is Southeast Asia, top issue, windstorms, then market crash, human pandemic, earthquake, flood. No, these are backward looking, they're not forward looking. These are just looking at the macro risks to these places. This is the kind of indices you use when you're looking to invest, but there's lots of others, that's just one. So, That's where we think we are, and but we think that means there's a big opportunity. We think the reality, but only if we grip it. And so some of the ideas we're looking for, we're going to put on the table for reform over the next 4 years. So we would like to see a more coherent reform process saying we need to integrate climate resilience throughout the UN and broader international system in the way we have done it with low carbon. So in a sense, the mitigation has kind of started to get that coherence, but we've not really looked at this as a real reform process as opposed to a set of individual pieces. And there's an opportunity with the new Secretary General, I think, to move that. We think there's a case, though we're always happy to argue about it, that if you're going to have institutional reform, someone needs to be in charge, and there's a place for a special envoy, an SG special envoy, to do that, and to think about how the UN Security Council and the General Assembly get updates on the impacts of climate change on UN, on peace, security, human rights, development. 'Cause that's not the IPCC, that does not do that work. And no one currently does that, so whose job is that? Someone has to have the mandate to report there, like OCHA does, like we have on the Peace Building Committee. So there's kind of analogies in the system. But we need then for capacity. If you're going to, if WHO and others and FAO are going to, who do they go to for climate advice? Again, it's not the IPCC. And we would like to see the UNFCCC Secretariat, you can argue UNEP could do it, there's arguments about where it sits. We need a capacity for risk assessment, for looking at tail risks, for looking at socioeconomic risks, for going beyond. Because we know unless someone's doing that, it's very hard for implementing ministries to do it. So it makes sense as a horizontal function. But we need to ensure that conflict sensitivity is built on the other side into analysis of adaptation spending and prioritize governance building resilience. So we don't build the wrong dams that cause conflict. We don't build the wrong water systems that concentrate power and heighten ethnic tension. We don't ignore issues of land tenure when we're thinking about how we access different types of approach. We're working in Colombia on the hopefully post-peace plan process, doing environment and climate analysis of the peace plans to make sure that when people go back to the region, they go back to a sustainable governance system. And that's a very interesting practical task around building conflict sensitivity into environment and climate plans. We think to get people to realize what to do, to get over this issue of what do we do, what does this mean, we should focus on piloting integration of climate and energy and resource issues into some big resilience programs in fragile areas. And the obvious ones are North Africa, European lead priority, Mekong, US lead priority, and East Africa / Horn Yemen, no one's priority at the moment. You can argue about whether that's, so unfortunately, too far gone to work on. But if you're looking at places which are live conflicts, which building peace requires you to analyze, those are the places. So let's do the big things in big places, important places, because that might get money to flow to them a bit more. And we think there's a real case for designing the extreme risk weather insurance schemes, which are currently underway and building in Africa and the Caribbean and the Pacific and Asia, to target some of them, build them to make sure they can target and deal with at-conflict areas. At the moment, they're focused on economically productive areas, not the most at-risk areas, and that's an area we're currently researching. And the core theme of all of this is to reform the system so that the urgent, and there will be more urgent, because that's the way the world's going, doesn't displace the important. So we need to create places where people can do the medium to long-term work while the urgent is being managed, and people to understand why they need to do that in order to get out of the crises, which is and that's about capacity and headspace and budgets and institutional reform. And the last one, and it's okay, if it's a reform agenda, it requires to move budgets, it requires politics, because you never get, and top-down politics, because you never get budgets shifted without top-down politics. So, so some pieces here. Again, we think security actors need to take a bit more responsibility for why Paris works, and I mean Paris working by increasing mitigation in 2020. So security actors need to be stronger in pointing out the consequences of not increasing mitigation, which they haven't been as strong. But I think there's other actors like financial regulators, investors, and cities, people with an interest in long-term stability, because their job requires keeping climate risk below a certain level to achieve their main task. And we're seeing a whole range of people, and I think there's a broad issue there. How do we get that message to the mitigation community, aside about the consequence of not managing climate change. Because I can tell you, they do not get it. They think it's a marginal percentage of GDP. They do not see it causing system failure. And how we're going to move to nearer, well below 2 and 1.5, unless they get that, that's a critical issue. There's a real opportunity to move forward in international system reform. You know, what about making this one of the priorities for the new UN Secretary General, and countries making it a priority for the candidates and signaling to the candidates they want to see follow-up of Paris and 2015 process as a priority in their pitches, and working with the High Ambition Coalition, which includes all the vulnerable countries, 140 countries, which we built at Paris to deliver this reform as well as take forward the Paris Agreement in UNFCCC. We think there's a need for stronger US-EU cooperation, and there are discussions ongoing around that. There's a new climate change working group being set up. But if Europe Europe needs to show a bit of leadership, and we're failing. I mean, we're really politically failing in the North African region. And how do we engage other major countries? China is very worried too. Is this an area where we can build those bridges and use that? Because the core thing is, what's the coalition of countries who will back this change? Unless we can point to a coalition of countries who want to see these changes happen, we will always be in the margins. But again, I think this is, especially given the political timelines here, and then in Europe we have, France and Germany have elections in 2017. Always a chance to set mandates and set priorities, and this is a really interesting time, I think, with the new SG to think about how we get, if we think these reforms are necessary and important, how do we make sure they get on the top table agenda? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. I think you covered a lot of very interesting ground. You started off by telling us, I like very much your framing, the world as an egg on the edge of a table, some real Jeopardy. You could hear the Jeopardy music cueing there. But some important points that I think really came out, sort of rethinking the Paris Agreement in terms of this climate risk management regime and where it has brought us to now and what that means. I think a very interesting representation of looking at Paris in terms of this crash response and high climate sensitivity and sort of the responsive reactions to that framing and what that means for us. I think you talk a little bit about the space for long-term preventative methods getting crowded out, which is something that we have spoken to about, we've spoken about here. I was quite intrigued at your map looking at climate risk and seeing that those concerns are coming out in emerging economies. I hope we could talk a little bit more about that. And once again, leading to your point that attention hasn't led to action, looking at the operational gaps and how do we move from the technocratic approaches to looking at social responses that bring in governance, the institutional concerns, the bureaucratic responses, and mobility on the political side. And then moving to the opportunities, which I think leads in quite nicely to what we want to talk about with Ken, looking at what does that mean for the UN Security Council, the reform process, linking peace, security, rights, development, risk assessment, conflict sensitivity, resilience programming, extreme weather, risk insurance, and what it means for alliances and cooperation moving forward. So thanks. I think that was really excellent framing for Ken's comments. So Ken Conker is a professor for American University's School of International Service. His research and teaching focuses on global environmental governance, environmental peace building in war-torn societies, environmental politics and policy in the United Nations system, water governance and environmental policy and analysis. He's the author, editor of several books on international environmental politics, including Governing Water, Confronting Consumption, Environmental Peace Building, The Crisis of Global Environmental Governance. A lot of this is used for teaching also. And Ken has just been named a fellow at the Wilson Center, which is excellent. We're looking forward to welcoming you with us later in this year. So Ken, I'll hand it over to you to build on Nick's comments.
Well, thank you, Roger Mark. It's always a pleasure to be here, and it'll be a pleasure to be here on a regular basis starting in the fall. So two things that I think, building on what Nick said, two focal points that I'm going to try to build on. One, I think Paris and the SDGs really do define the landscape for better or for worse. And so essentially one of the messages that I took out of Nick's comments was that if you really want to be able to do risk assessment in a whole of governance and strategic and forward-looking way, it requires a combination of institutional reform and political leadership. And so how do Paris and the SDGs converge to create a landscape in which we have to try to create that political leadership and engage those questions of institutional reform? So one of those books that Roger Mark alluded to, which I published just last year, was called An Unfinished Foundation, the United Nations and Global Environmental Governance. And the elevator speech argument in that book was that if you look at the mandate, the charter of the United Nations and the mandate of the UN, there's a very clear four-part mission for the organization: peace, development, human rights, and international law. If you look at the history of environmental initiatives in the UN, you see that the UN really only stands on two of its four legs. There's a lot of work on development, there's a lot of work on international law. Until recently, there's been very little on peace and conflict and the environmental linkages, and also very little on the environment as a human, the right to enjoy a quality environment as a human right. And the argument in the book is essentially, part of the book is about how did it get to be that way, and what are the problems with trying to do 21st century global environmental governance when you're only standing on two of those four legs. But part of the book also is why it's so important to have conflict-sensitive, peace-building, and rights-based approaches. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the context of a couple of specific institutional settings. The first is the Security Council. And the question of climate change and international peace and security has been bubbling up in the Security Council for almost a decade now. The British did a one-day thematic session in 2007. The Germans followed that up with a one-day thematic session in 2011. There have been two so-called ARIA formula, which are basically informal, outside of chambers sessions on it as well in the last couple of years. It's been highly contentious. I would say up until now, it's mainly been a question of when the UNFCCC goes down, the Security Council conversation goes up, and it's mainly been driven by people with a sense of urgency about climate, trying to do some agenda setting, try to use the kind of media garnering and bully pulpit foundation of the Security Council. It's partly been contentious because there are actors that don't want it to be talked about in the Security Council for a range of different reasons. Some concerned that that conversation would damage the UNFCCC. Some concerns about Security Council politics. Is it inclusive? The hierarchy of power, the reform agenda within the Council, and so on and so forth. And so until now, it's mostly been about the politics of agenda setting and issue framing. But I think one of the subtexts of some of Nick's comments, at least what I would argue, is that it's going to be really important to have a capable and functional Security Council on the questions of climate change and international conflict. But if you look at what an actual operational role for the Security Council might look like around climate change, you very quickly realize that we don't have the Security Council that we need in order to be able to do this in an effective way, in a legitimate way, and in a broadly based way. There are at any one time 15 to 20 peacekeeping missions in the field. All but one of them, since the end of the Cold War, has been in the field for at least one extreme weather event or natural disaster. And yet the Council really doesn't have the capacity to inform itself in an effective way about the climate change ramifications for its current operations. There's been a lot of talk about early warning and preventive action. There's been resolutions try to move the Council toward being more of a preventive body and linking up information systems so that the kinds of human rights early warning and famine and threat of conflict early warning systems that we sort of have in place sync better with climate information. But of course the Council is a very reactive body. It's not particularly effective in moving toward preventive action. A lot of talk about environmental refugees. Refugees really move the dial within the Security Council when you start having impacts of conflict on civilians and large numbers of people moving, whether it fits the international definition of a refugee as somebody who's fleeing for political reasons beyond the borders of their state, or whether it's in the more general category of displaced people who have a very vague status in international law. It is certainly something that garners the Council's attention. It's also something the Council's quite reluctant to engage, prefers to conceptualize the problem in terms of that legal definition of politically and internationally mobile individuals only, and leave it to the UN High Commissioner's Office or the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. The small island developing states problem is one that's looming. You're talking about several members of the United Nations that are looking at being essentially states without territory, because many of the Pacific Island atolls will become uninhabitable long before they're underwater, either because of storm vulnerability or threats to water supplies. And that's an issue where we lack a clear space. It would take the World Court 30 years to give us the kinds of judgments that we would need to act on that. And so there's been some talk that that's a space that the Security Council could effectively fill. I was doing some interviews in the Secretary General's office in New York around a project I'm working on the idea of what an operational role for the Security Council might look like. And the response on the small island developing states that we got consistently was, that's a problem for 2050. Well, yeah, it is a problem for 2050, and it illustrates the reactive nature of the Council, the inability to manage information. I think of the sort of time frame that you were talking about, which is somewhere in between the daily crisis briefing and the IPCC scenarios, right? Regional scale, decade long. I mean, that's the information gap that we really, really need to be able to fill. All of this is moving toward the idea, I think, of a climate-related responsibility to protect. The Security Council has, of a fashion, embraced the norm of responsibility to protect, although in a very narrowly limited way, around war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. There was a cyclone in Myanmar, Burma, in 2009, and the French actually tried to mobilize a Security Council resolution invoking the responsibility to protect because the Burmese government had closed the borders and was denying access for several days of the international relief community. And the French got smacked down. It was very clear that the Security Council was not willing to extend the concept of a responsibility to protect, around which it has a very fragile political consensus. And it's important to preserve that consensus. I'm not suggesting we should redefine R2P to be war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and climate change. I mean, that would destroy the fragile consensus that we already have. But some sort of a concept of the international community's responsibility for protection is coming, and it's something that the Council has not been able to deal with. So to me, the Council illustrates a lot of the themes about how we need to bring to bear, concentrated political leadership with a much more capable institution. Rather than running this problem through the existing institution that we have, we need the institution to grow toward the problem that we're increasingly facing. And so some of the ideas that I think make sense in this regard is when countries stand for election to the Security Council, or when countries indicate that they would like to be a permanent member in a reformed Security Council, they should be challenged to explain what they think the Council's role is on climate change. The Secretary General's Sahel Initiative, which I thought was a very interesting attempt to think in the terms that I was talking about, maybe decade out, regional scale, I think much more of that sort of work, and giving the Council the kind of informational capabilities. I mean, the powerful countries on the Council have their own information systems, and they don't share information very well, and the weak countries on the Council don't have any kind of an institutionalized capacity to manage that sort of information itself. And so that, to me, is a critical challenge. I also think, in terms of political leadership, it would be very interesting to challenge the P5 to take some sort of symbolic action on climate that was avowedly seen as a conflict-managing, peace-building sort of initiative. I'm not sure the politics of that is feasible at the moment, but as we think 2, 3, 4 years out, I think pushing in that direction could be quite interesting. The second thing I'll speak to, and just very briefly, so we have plenty of time for discussion, is the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals, I think, are a real improvement compared to the Millennium Development Goals, and there's much to be applauded about both the resulting goals and the process. It was a much more participatory process than the MDGs, which was a small group of people who were desperate to maintain the momentum of the Millennium Summit and thought that articulating some goals would be a good way to focus the international community's attention. The SDGs were a much more participatory process, not perfect, but better. The SDGs have a much more universal character. There's a much more comprehensive approach, not just within the goals, but also between them. I think the idea of leaving no one behind and the idea of reaching those who are furthest behind first, which are sort of implicit in much of the SDG process, are critically important. The big concern I have about the SDGs is the lack of a rights-based approach and the lack of making human rights much more central into that context. And what I would add to Nick's comments about the need to combine institutional reform with political leadership, which is me characterizing your comments, but hopefully not inaccurately. The question is where's the political energy going to come that's going to concentrate that political leadership? And to me, it's people as rights holders in the context of these challenges that really ultimately provides us with the political energy, as opposed to the desired foresight of governments. I think the SDGs were really missed opportunity to infuse a more rights-based approach. Some of the reasons why you'd want to do that, I think rights-based approaches help us to prioritize. If you look at the health goal within the Sustainable Development Goals, there are many people in the health community that wanted that goal to be universal access to health care. Very simple, and then everything flows from that. Instead, universal access is buried down in a mix of about 15 targets with no prioritization among them. So it doesn't concentrate the political leadership, and it doesn't then allow the institutions to grow toward that reformed conception of the problem. And so I think rights-based approaches really help us establish priorities. The second thing is the intersectionality, right? We've got all these goals: food, water, health, education. It's the connective tissue between them that is the real space for synergistic opportunities, where you can invest smaller amounts of money in efficient ways and leverage several goals at once. So the link between the rights of women, the need to haul water, and the lack of access to education is very, very well understood. It's also almost invisible in the way that the SDGs are now written, separating education, health, water, and the rights of women, as it has done. And so human rights bring that intersectionality that I think is critically important. And the third thing that human rights bring is the process rights. People's rights to information, people's rights to participation, people's rights to redress. If you look at Goal 16, which is actually the goal under the broad rubric of peace, one of the targets under Goal 16 is to make sure that people have access to the basic information they need so that they can pursue their rights in the context of the SDG. But it's made subject to the limits of national legislation, and of course there are many countries in the world where people don't enjoy those kinds of information rights, to say nothing about participatory rights or rights of redress. And so again, a missed opportunity to use the symbolic power of human rights to leverage people being able to mobilize around the realization of those rights. And so I think this, in very different ways, I think the rollout of the SDGs and the agenda that's looming for the Security Council illustrate the point that what we really need is not to be running these problems through the institutions that we have, but to be challenging these institutions to sort of grow toward where the problem, in fact, is bringing us. I was going to say a little bit about a third institutional challenge, but in the interest of time, I'll cut it. I'll just have 30 seconds, okay, on that, and then I'll be done. And that's climate engineering. If you look at what Paris actually did, my take on Paris is that it's great that it brings adaptation into the mix. It's great that it universalizes the problem as opposed to this kind of north versus south structure of Kyoto and so on. But what Paris essentially did is it sets a very ambitious goal, well below 2 degrees C, with essentially a voluntary opt-in approach where countries define their nationally determined commitments. And as you pointed out, the math on that just doesn't add up. Well, one of the really interesting results that may come from that combination of a highly ambitious goal and a lack of traction through basically a voluntary opt-in regime is the idea of climate engineering. And this is something where highly controversial, highly potential to provoke conflict on all sorts of levels. Not necessarily something that's likely to be done by large. There's a lot of, the people who've really kind of made an issue about climate engineering like to talk a lot about the idea that it'll come from powerful corporations or it'll come from hegemonic governments and so on. It seems to me the most likely scenario for somebody trying to do some serious, large-scale interventions in the environment to promote some sort of mitigative effects is a large developing country taking action on a regional scale. And that because the ability to do it is not necessarily the limiting factor. And so essentially what I would say about climate engineering is that it's something with a great deal of potential for unknown risks and unintended consequences. It creates a great deal of moral hazard in the sense that if we start doing that, we might think we're on an easy path and we don't do the hard work that we need to do to deal with the climate problem. It puts us on a treadmill because once you start doing it, especially if you're not doing that other hard work, you can't stop or you're in a worse place than you were before you started. It has tremendous potential to create winners and losers on a regional scale, which is a recipe for conflict. And there's no regulatory framework. And so that, to me, is a case where we really don't have any kind of an institutional setting. And I think it's going to be important to start thinking about creating one now before people who can wield the technology start filling the space, as I think eventually they probably inevitably will. Stop there.
Great. Thank you very much, Ken. So I think some key takeaways in terms of looking at the Security Council and an operational role for the council that's effective, legitimate, and broadly based. A couple of things that you said that really I thought were appealing is this time frame. How do you move beyond this daily crisis briefing and finding that sweet spot between the IPCC time frame so that there's an opportunity to act? And this question of climate-related responsibility to protect, which I think you talked about in the context of the Security Council, but I think is also reflected in your comments in thinking a little bit about the SDGs from a rights-based perspective and what that means in terms of establishing priorities, recognizing the intersectionality between the SDGs and the process rights, access to information, redress, and sort of reframing the thinking around climate engineering and recognizing the conflict potential around framing on climate engineering, questions around moral hazards, getting on the treadmill, creating winners and losers, and a lack of a regulatory framework. Thank you very much. So Sherry Goodman is going to talk a little bit about this in the US context. Sherry Goodman is a public policy fellow here at the Wilson Center and has served as president and CEO of the Consortium for Ocean Leadership. She was Senior Vice President and General Counsel of CNA, a research organization for national security leaders and public sector organizations. She served as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, Environmental Security, responsible for global environmental safety and occupational health programs and policies of the Department of Defense, and was the first female professional staff member on the staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee. So Sherry, welcome.
Thank you, Roger Mark, and thank you all for being here today. Let me thank first Nick for his leadership in this area. I got to know Nick over a decade ago. I think it was about when you referred multiple times to the 2007 UN Special Assembly, and as the founder of the CNA Military Advisory Board on climate change and national security, we released with a group of military leaders in 2007 the first report, which that special session used, the UK foreign minister used as sort of Exhibit A to talk about climate as a national security challenge. So we've been doing this work together for at least that long. And let me also thank Roger Mark and the team here at the Wilson Center, which I'm pleased to have joined this year, for also your work and long leadership in connecting the dots on climate, climate change, development, diplomacy, and now defense. And Ken, I know you've also been toiling in these fields for a long time, since this whole program, the Environmental Change and Security Program, got started back in the Castle some years ago, which some of us are old enough, unfortunately, to remember. So, with these two very robust discussions, I just want to add a little bit, since we've talked a lot about the diplomacy and the development side, and as you know, my background comes at this from defense. So let me say a little bit about that, recognizing, I think when you look at where we are, while we have a long way to go, and there's no question that as the President Obama said, climate change really is an existential challenge. We will combat terrorism, we will deal with ISIS, but whether we can deal with climate change and its existential impact to our planet is still undetermined. And so we are, I think, in a process of coming to grips with that in terms of our security apparatus. And we're not fully there yet because it takes a long time for wheels of government and individuals, and it's a generational response. But we've come a long way, I would say, in the last 10 years. And in the U.S., I think there's much more attention to it now. I think we're coming close to the end of the U.S. domestic political debate where climate change is a dirty word in some parts of the country. I just returned from a meeting of the Joint Ocean Commission in New Orleans, where part of the country where in the South it still is verboten to speak too publicly about climate change, but in fact they feel the effects more on a more regular basis than in many other parts of the country. And now you see, I think, at the local level and the regional level that planning and recognition is in place, and people realize that combination of sea level rise and coastal erosion and extreme weather events are a toxic mix, and that they need to come to grips with it now. So I think that the U.S. leadership has really stepped up in this administration. You know, the president and this administration made leadership in Paris a huge initiative, and were very successful in the agreement first with China and then in Paris. And the clean energy leadership on that is sort of the other side of the climate coin. And I think we are, you know, in the phase of transforming our energy system. That doesn't happen overnight, but, you know, we are becoming a clean energy powerhouse in our own nation. We see that changing around the world. Sure, we're going to have a mix of fossil fuels for a long, long time to come, but I think we're beginning to see evidence of that change and the economic opportunity that comes from that. And I think the next phase is to really appreciate the economic opportunities that come from building more resilient communities globally, regionally, and at the local level. And I think that's what we've been talking about, that in terms of both institutions, UN, and other institutions, but the actual operational work is going to occur down on the ground at the local level. And a lot of that's going to be about how we deal with water. Water is really the front line of climate change. Too much water, too little water, and I think we're going to see a lot more focus on that in the future. So let me just say a few minutes about a little bit about how I see the national security apparatus responding to this in the U.S. As I said, the president has made this a priority. The White House is focused on trying to develop a post-Paris, both a range of resilience initiatives and a climate security directive that the president can issue before the end of the administration. I think that will be a major step forward. Will that solve all the problems? No, because you still have to have, you have a directive, you have a strategy, you still have to have plans and budgets in various agencies that reflect that. So what I've observed, in the last decade is that the planning across the U.S. government has become much more robust to deal with climate change across both domestic agencies and national security, defense, foreign policy agencies. From the State Department, where Secretary Kerry has an agency-wide directive to incorporate climate security risks across all parts of the department, regional as well as functional. I serve on the Secretary of State's International Security Advisory Board, which is sort of the hard security board, traditionally deals with things like nuclear weapons and arms control. And I'm seeing in the work we do there, including a study we're doing right now on the Arctic, that climate is an essential element of sort of developing our future security considerations. And the Secretary of State's own passions, of course, run to climate change and oceans, and water and energy, and so he takes every opportunity he has to constructively engage on that. The intelligence community has done quite a lot in recent years. I think it's challenged, but it has helped provide a good amount of leadership there. There's obviously more that can be done. Defense, I think, really stepped into this game. DOD, back in 2008-9, when it did its first quadrennial defense, QDR, quadrennial defense review, and it's updated that since then. I think we've seen some of that flow down, both through the combatant commands and through the individual services. The Navy has been a strong leader here. Current Secretary of the Navy, Secretary Mabus, has made energy one of his top 3 priorities in 8 years, probably the longest-serving Secretary of the Navy, or one of the longest-serving Secretary of the Navy, and he took on an agenda that was seemingly quite controversial when he came in, to make energy a priority for his tenure, and I think he's really set a lot in motion by diversifying the fuel mix on which the Navy, with its big platforms, sea-based and air platforms, relies, and at the same time take a lot of work looking at how shore-based facilities will be affected by climate change. So we're seeing that across all the services now. And just last week, the Department of Defense issued what I think is a very, it looks like a technical report, and it is, but it's a very important report done through the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program that looks at regional sea level rise scenarios for military installations. And what's, I think, important about this report is both the methodology and its potential far-reaching impact. It's a public report, and it has 3 time frames it looks at. 2035, okay? Now that's important because that's only 20 years out, okay? It looks at 2035, 2065, and 2100. Many people get put off, who are not like us sitting around here wanting to spend the morning talking about climate change, get put off by scenarios that go out to 2100 because they say, that's not in my time frame. And planners and green eye shade comptroller types say, I'm not going to be alive then, and neither is anybody in this room. So you need to have, and we've been challenged by global climate models to be able to have models that are useful in near time frames. But this report does that. And I think that's going to be important because that's going to enable planners in military installations and throughout defense and in local communities who care about whether that military base is going to be viable and sustainable in their communities. And they're often major sources of economic vitality where they are located, to understand what it takes to keep that military installation and therefore that community resilient into the future. So I think that those are some good signs on the horizon. Clearly we have a lot of challenges still It's going to take leadership continuing both through the remaining of this administration and into the next administration, and hopefully in Congress, where we're seeing some bright signs of more bipartisan support than we've had clearly in the past, to address and recognize climate as a security challenge.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think it's good to bring this back home and see what's happening in terms of the national security apparatus, what it means moving beyond just directives and having a sense of how this is happening in intelligence, defense, the Navy, and recognizing this recent report looking at sea level rise for military installations. So let's take it to you now. We'd like to get some comments, thoughts, questions from you. My colleagues will come to you with a microphone. If you can just raise your hand, give your name and affiliation, and get to your question or comment fairly quickly so we can take a few of them and have an opportunity to engage. Should we start with you?
Thank you. Thank you very much for this presentation. It's very informative. I'm Mike Ashford. I'm an independent consultant. I'm currently with Comonix, a consulting firm. I wonder if you might, perhaps starting with Nick, and comment on the efficacy of the current climate finance structures and taking off from the global risk discussions that you mentioned, and perhaps the international financial institutions that are addressing this, the tools for that, the funding, and where your assessment of how effective that's going to be.
Great, thank you. Yes?
Hi, my name's Frank Schwing. I'm with NOAA. And one of the most provocative things I saw was the map about the perceived threats by nations. And it seems to me that we perhaps understand better how to combat more traditional threats, human threats, institutions, less so these extrinsic threats, as Sherry mentioned. But to me, the other fact perhaps is the media tends to reinforce and drive these more immediate perceived threats of ISIS, things like that. They don't understand how to relate longer-term threats like climate change. So how do we combat that to get public opinion more to addressing these things? And which of those two factors, perhaps, the institutional threat versus the media, is most important for us to try to overcome?
Great, thank you. Yes, I think someone, yes, please.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for the wonderful presentations. My name is Joseph Mugore. I'm an independent consultant. The reason I came to this meeting is not because I'm into climate and environment, but because I just came from a country as a consultant where climate, conflict, development are all abundant. And my job was to write what in the UN is called common country assessment. And I was trying to integrate all these things into this thing. And I have a couple of questions on that. One is, I try to have a discussion about, okay, you've been doing environment. Now there's Paris. What's the change? I said I would challenge them to think about that. And they said, no, we don't know. What's the change? They asked me, and I said, I don't know. So there's an information gap that needs to be filled, and I don't know who fills it. The second part of that is how, when you think about countries in conflict, the obvious objective is to not worsen the conflict, and more especially to worsen the impact on the environment. This country I'm talking about, I used to go there like 10 years ago. I was working for the UN. Go there, they were one of the most advanced in terms of environmental thinking, in terms of planning. In terms of, they are very well, the Horn of Africa, Eritrea, it's not a secret, Eritrea. They were very advanced in their thinking about climate, different from all the other countries I was visiting. I go there in 2015 into 2016. Environment and climate are not much of a priority. Not that they're not thinking about it, but it's no longer thing that they say we are going to have to do this, because they are now preoccupied with conflict. And that conflict has not been ameliorated by the global community, but exacerbated with sanctions, with all kinds of things, including, you talked, Ken, about human rights, including an overdose of human rights sanctioning and all that. So in a situation with environmental exposure, climate risk, previous political commitment, now there's decreasing commitment and increasing potential, not just of the conflict that caused this decrease, but also the actual neglect of the environmental circumstances. So how do these institutional reform issues that you're talking about impact at this level? Which takes me to my third and final point, which is that even when there's no conflict, even in other little normal countries, but little countries, how do we take these frameworks and turn them into support systems for country analysis, country programming, and country evaluation, et cetera, et cetera? There's and the illustration of how that's not working is when you say the UN has been working on two legs. It shows how much the efforts have been meaningless, because I mean, with UNEP there, for you to say it was just international law and development, but UNEP, the UNDP has huge environment programs. Climate change was proclaimed as an important leg of development about 10 years ago. The fact that we can still say that, and it's true that it looks like it's walking on two legs, means the effectiveness is very low. What do these grand strategies have to say about those very specific things at country level? Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. Any other questions? Yes, please, Francesca, behind you.
This is a comment, sorry. Luc van der Stegen from the Royal Netherlands Embassy. To tie into Mr. Maybe, we had a planetary security conference last year, and we're going to have one for the coming 3 years. We secured funds and high-level participation from both our ministers. And I would like to invite you to give me your cards or contact details to be put into our database, because we want to go forward on the planetary security issue.
Great, thank you very much, Luke. And in fact, Nick did mention the Planetary Security Conference. I'm going to add one question and then take it back out to you. So at the Planetary Security Conference that Luke was talking about, one of the key issues, I was in charge of the track on Africa. So we were looking at these questions on conflict, climate, and fragility for Africa. And we had a lot of diplomats in the room. And they said to me, you know, Roger Mark, the problem is we have a shortage of diplomatic tools. So for those who are diplomats on the front lines of addressing these issues, they said we need to think more about what else we can be doing. So I wonder if you could talk about any thoughts on diplomatic tools on a real operational level on the front lines for the diplomatic community. So questions on climate finance. Do you have a sense of how they're doing, what the potential is? How do we move to thinking about these perceived threats and public opinion and mobilizing around that? When you think of what has happened at Paris, how do you talk about the change post-Paris at the country level? If there are questions around conflict that is taking all of the country's priorities from a policymaking perspective, how do you still work in questions on environment and climate? How do you develop support systems at the country level? And then ideas on diplomatic tools for those who are on the front lines. So short list of easy questions. So you can address one or all of the above and any additional comments you'd like to make. So can we come down this way? Nick, would you like to start?
Okay, so I start on the finance piece, and I'll kind of split it into public and private finance, because I think there's a kind of parallel process going on in terms of reform, massive reform in the finance system, which was kicked off by 2015. It's going a lot faster than the security foreign policy reform changes. Interesting working these two communities at the same time. They came later, but they're moving faster. On the public side, you know, there's all of the multilateral development banks, bilateral donors, bilateral development banks have to incorporate climate change into their work. First papers from World Bank came out in the spring meetings this week. That's a process ongoing. It's very mitigation heavy, and on these sorts of issues, the interesting thing is we've not managed to get money out of the door of the public banks or the public donors onto adaptation very well. In the UK, I think we're getting out 15%. Our target is 50% of our climate finance. Why is that? Well, because we don't know how to do it. And we don't know how to do it in the UK either. So, and there's sometimes this assumption that some experts out there know how to do this. We're kind of not humble enough sometimes about we don't know how to do this. And we certainly don't know how to do it in ways that support community learning. It's an analogy we use on energy efficiency. Just like it's easier to build one power plant than do 1 million energy efficiency retrofits, even though those are better value and more resilient to the future, it's much easier to do a big hard water system than it is to do lots of community water management projects in terms of deployability. And that's the problem. So we lack the capacity to build a pipeline of really good adaptation, especially ones based around soft skills and community management. And that's a real problem for our public finance. So this issue of building pipelines of more complex joined up projects came up, a lot of the finance discussions running up to Paris between all the development banks. And I think the African Development Bank is actually looking at building pipeline capacity. It's really a leader in this. But it's a good example of you need small money to make the big money work, and we're missing some of the small money to do the more clever stuff. Because there's cuts, because alongside this, there's budget cuts in every development agency and diplomacy agency around the world. So we want more money to spend and less people to spend it cleverly. Most of this stuff is a high kind of intelligence quotient around doing the project. So that's the first one. So projects, things ongoing, but there's some real tensions about the reform, the kind of cuts to people's capacity and delivering these kind of complex projects. The result there is to build more national capacity. There is a lot of capacity building money earmarked by Paris, a tsunami of capacity building. I've been through several tsunamis of capacity building money. Most of it's wasted. And I think one of the key targets should be to make sure that this round of capacity building money is spent cleverly to actually build capacity, not just in recipient governments by taking out their civil servants and taking away for 6 months, which is what often happens, but actually building non-governmental capacity and community capacity to use the available climate finance that's growing in clever ways to increase resilience. That's the public sector side. On the private side, there is basically the private sector doesn't look at this risk issue very well. When it does, it tends to get out rather than change. It's starting to become more aware. There's more consultancy. There's more involvement from the insurance industry. Actually, the G20 process looking at climate change will focus on transition risks because the climate impacts risk issue is too complex and the data is not available, but that will come a bit slower. That's talking to the Bank of England and People's Bank of China who are running that process and the Bloomberg process. So, but I think you're starting to see kind of quite large private sector actors like Moody's, Standard & Poor's. They do sovereign risk assessments now of climate vulnerability, of government sovereign debt. Lloyd's doing around cities, companies. So I think it'll move quite fast. It's quite crude, but actually in the private finance, as long as it's a number, they don't really care how crude it is. That could have quite negative impacts actually on countries who are perceived as being poorly governed in this area, like mine, for example. But I think, being non-flippant. So yeah, lots of opportunity, but I think there's, this issue of trying to make sure we actually take advantage of the money that's available and the capacity that's available is the big issue for me. And be, I say, a bit humble about the limits of our knowledge and about unintended consequences. And that's where I come back to this issue of how do you deal with countries who are in conflict and focus on this. Because this is really important, post-Arab Spring, we chucked $30 billion, or tried to, at North Africa. And they were told, the bank, the EBRD and the EIB and KfW were told, go and make jobs. The conflict prevention strategy from the G7 was, make jobs so young people don't fight. I mean, it's grow the economy and support civil society. And that was basically the brief. Now, what kind of jobs? So, again, let's go and what do they, EBRB knows how to build big hard water systems. Does that actually help resilience? Or investing in, they need power, so let's build a gas power plant, exposing the country to large balance of payments issues around imported fossil fuels. So we did a whole set of resilience assessments. So a lot of the time, this rush to put in money as a kind of just post or in the middle of a conflict situation, supposedly as stabilization measures, were increasing vulnerability to external shock. They were exacerbating tensions at the country level. And the reason people were doing projects like that was because they were under pressure to disperse and they didn't have the skills to do more complex projects, back to the first point. And that's why I come back to the last diplomatic tools question. I used to work in UK Foreign Ministry. I ran the UK Climate and Energy Attaches Network and also did conflict prevention. What I want my diplomats to do is to precisely go to the development guys dispersing money and say, if you do that, you will exacerbate tensions. I know the political economy of this country. I know how it works politically. I'm going to do that conflict-sensitive analysis because that's what the diplomats should be doing. There's a proposal that will do better on low internal resilience, and also there's a cooperative approach here in the region that might be better. So again, in Latin America where we work, El Nino and climate change are undermining hydropower as a source of energy. They can't move to fossil, or they realize the risks of investing in fossil to make up for that variability. The actual solution is to have a regional grid, because El Nino hits differentially months across the region, so you can actually balance out the new fluctuations in water. That's a huge diplomatic challenge. Someone needs to help them sew that together. The same thing in Southeast Asia and ASEAN, actually. That's where diplomatic tools can help. When the best solution, the most resilient solution, the one that builds cooperation, and which is another form of resilience, that's where the diplomats have to get in, because the people who build dams aren't going to do that. The development people aren't going to do that. It's not their skill set. So again, I think there are some really, but political analysis and cooperative approaches, particularly between countries, are things where the diplomats need to step in and help the people who know how to spend money on projects, produce the right projects, and increase the number of alternatives. Because in the end, we're seeing people fall back on old solutions, which are not resilient and actually can exacerbate the problem because they cannot do anything else, and they feel under pressure to disperse money.
Thank you. Sherry?
Okay, let me pick up on that I'll start with the last point about the diplomatic tools. I agree we need a more robust set of tools in our toolkit to diplomatically, and that as we look at really the energy and water solutions to a lot of the climate challenges, which is where the rubber's going to meet the road. Those are the things we need to do to combat climate change at the local level, and some of those solutions, as Nick just described, whether it's in Latin America or Asia and Africa, may extend across national boundaries. And I think that's where diplomats need to be creative. I think that's where the U.S. needs to look in a more integrated 3D way, not just the defense tool, the diplomacy and the development tool integrated across the way to see what those opportunities are, and also to recognize that these can be confidence-building measures. Often we've used that frame, comes from the arms control era, where we were dealing with the Soviet Union and thinking about how do we manage this relationship during an era of high tension, not to have a miscalculation that could lead to further escalation of the conflict. But I think we can think about these types of tools as confidence-building measures that build engagement and cooperation, and I'm beginning to see some work occur in that area. On the gentleman's question about how to rally public opinion, I noticed just in the last week that there were 2 stories in the U.S. media about climate refugees in the U.S. One, a statement by the Secretary of Interior about climate refugees in Alaska. We could debate, and Lauren has pointed out that whether you use the word climate refugees is the right terminology, but I take the point, but I also note that it puts it out there in a way that has, it gives it a local, it's a story at the local level. And also, as I said, I just came from New Orleans. There is a tribal nation one of whose communities on an island is, they all have to move now because they've got the sea level is right in their backyard and they're being relocated. And this is the first of a number of tribal communities in the Gulf region that's going to have to move for a combination of sea level rise and coastal erosion. So I think I think we're going to have more of those stories. And it's going to take telling those stories very concretely will help bring this more to the attention of local and national decision makers. And then to the last some comment about, a question about climate and conflict. I think the Wilson Center's work with the Delphi and others on the G7 report has gone a long way to address that. I commend them for that. And I think it's helped move this challenge that financial analysts and planners face, which is what's the wolf closest to the sled today that I've got to fund. I found this all the time in defense when I was in DOD. Okay, we get climate change, we get that we need to deal with pollution prevention, but we got some other problem that's much more urgent. Like today, I got to deal with terrorism. And yes, we know that climate change is a problem, but it's not my wolf closest, to the sled today. And you might point out, well, if we don't invest today, it's going to cost more later. And people can recognize that, but still they say, I've got to make some hard choices today, and it's hard to invest in a lot more ice-breaking capability today for the Arctic but we are doing some of that, but it's hard to invest even more than we're investing because we've got to deal with conflicts more urgent in the Middle East, South China Sea, and elsewhere in Europe. So I think those are the kind of trade-offs, and that's why I take Nick's point, which I think is a good one, that in the insurance and the financial industry, even though they came to recognize the climate security challenge perhaps later than governments did, they're now acting faster because they're more motivated by the financial bottom line. And I think that's very important to recognize, and that they can be a great source of the solution here because they really appreciate the risk because it hits their pocketbook.
Thank you. Kent?
Yeah, so some really rich material in the questions. So I'll start with Joseph. Is it Joseph? Yes, sorry. I mean, I agree with much of what you said, and I hear the frustration. I'm tempted to ask you what country, but you would have told us if you wanted to tell us, so I won't ask you what. Oh, Eritrea. Okay, interesting. So just one caveat to it, and then I'm going to give some illustrations that I think might speak to your questions. So the budget of the UN Environment Program is roughly the equivalent of the budget of a small liberal arts college in the United States. I mean, sometimes we're just not serious, right? My university, which has about 6,000 undergraduates and about 6,000 graduate students, which makes it kind of a combination of a mid-sized liberal arts undergraduate school and a fairly sizable concentration of professional graduate activities. We give more in financial aid in 1 year than the UN Environment Program has for its entire budget most years. So if you want to go to grad school, come and see me, but that's a problem, and so that needs to be said. But you're quite right. If you start to then look at the donor community, where the bilaterals and the World Bank and UNDP and so on, there's a lot of resources that are concentrated there. And in fact, it's estimated that about a third of all development assistance is subsequently blown away by war or disaster. And so when you start talking about climate finance, which I'll have a few thoughts on in a moment, that's the first thing would be just sort of figuring out how to deal with that problem of the assets that don't perform because of the very instability that we're trying to address. So, I mean, in the post-conflict or post-disaster context in particular, on the one hand, I do think there's been a lot of realization in the last 10 years or so. I mean, I've done a lot of work on this. I'm part of the expert advisory group for the UN Environment Program. I've published a lot of basic research on this. I think there's general recognition that good natural resource management, good environmental governance, which often, as you said, it's not that it wasn't there, it gets disrupted, and then the question is kind of getting your legs back under you and so on, is critical. And you're kind of at a critical juncture, right? If you can deal with those things, not only can you recreate the economic foundation for people's livelihoods, you can also go a long way toward peace and reconciliation and other sorts of things to kind of put back to the kind of political and social elements of a war-torn society in some useful ways. And there are a lot of organizations out there like Search for Common Ground and others that are trying to work with some of those themes. And that if you don't address it, then it's really problematic given all of the other challenges that you face in those kinds of situations. So one of the things that's been happening, which I think illustrates the problems that you're pointing to, is the idea that there needs to be a more systematic approach by the donor community. So we've seen the rise in the last decade or so of the idea of a post-conflict needs assessment or a post-disaster needs assessment, which is supposed to be a kind of a rapid analytic appraisal of priorities for investment and for donor assistance and so on. There have been attempts to then kind of connect the dots to link that to the idea of some sort of a poverty reduction strategy paper, maybe the IMF or whomever is doing that. And then from that would come some sort of a multi-donor trust fund that would then mobilize the funding. So that process has now been, there are a dozen or more test cases where attempts to do that more systematic kind of programming. Eritrea is clearly not one of those cases, but there have been instances where that has been attempted. So I and one of my graduate students decided to take a look at the environmental gaze, the environmental focus. As you run through those 3 or 4 steps, what kinds of environmental issues are getting attention, and even if they're identified early on in the needs assessment, does it then carry through for funding? So we went through all these documents, we coded them, we look at where funds are being deployed, and we found a very striking pattern. There were basically 3 kinds of environmental themes in these documents. The first was infrastructure, so clean water, energy systems, and so on. The second would be ecosystem services, which are critically important, particularly to people in rural societies, live very close to the natural resource base and so on. And the third were a category that we called sort of contention around extraction, so forestry activities, mining activities, and things like that. What we found was that over the trajectory of the post-conflict needs assessment, the poverty reduction strategy paper, the multi-donor trust fund, the issues that were getting the sustained attention were the infrastructure issues. The issues that were not getting the sustained attention were, number one, the ecosystem services, which are critically important from a livelihood perspective, particularly in rural areas, although not exclusively. And the issues that were also not getting the attention were the contentious extractives that have such a potential for social conflict if not managed properly. So on the one hand, the good news was that there was a more systematic process, that the environment was getting more attention in that over time, and that funds were starting to be mobilized to address some of those problems. The bad news was there was the consistent pull of a kind of a traditional way of thinking about development as infrastructure in those cases that was crowding out some of the most important kinds of activity. And that is, I think, a good segue to Mike's point about climate finance. I don't accompany the blow-by-blow of what goes on with climate finance and the current conversation, but it seems to me there's 3 critical problems there that need to be, whatever climate finance regime or regimes we have has to be able to deal with. One is this very point about infrastructure, and particularly I think as we turn more toward private sector participation and public-private partnerships and so on, the tendency to view financing climate adaptation as building infrastructure and building large infrastructure projects can be quite overwhelming, and I think that's problematic. The second thing is, if this future is as uncertain as we think it is, if we're going to be investing in whether it's green infrastructure or gray infrastructure or livelihood adaptation, whatever it is that we're investing in, and we want to be able to look back 50 years from now and say those were well-chosen investments in the face of uncertainty, there's a large number of parameters that we really don't know. What are interest rates going to do? What's the right discount rate to look at on these projects? What's the price of water? What price of energy? The price of food? The value of land, et cetera, going to be in this period of time? And it's very hard to deploy our investment assets in a way that in hindsight we think makes sense. So if you need 1,000 watts of megawatts of energy on the scale of a watershed, you can build a big pile of concrete and generate 1,000 megawatts of energy. But what are the odds that you're going to design that in a way that it's going to look good 50 years from now, given the uncertainty in all of those basic parameters? So we need to think not in terms of one pile of 1,000 megawatts, but 10 of 100, or 100 of 10 megawatts, and a more, kind of decentralized, dispersed, and resilient. And this is the big gap well, certainly in development financing, right? We've got microcredit at the bottom, and we've got really large infrastructure projects at the top. It's those mid-range investments where, for all sorts of institutional and market failure kinds of reasons, it's very, very difficult to concentrate the kinds of investments that are needed. So dealing with the infrastructure bias first, dealing with this scale bias second, and then the third thing is I was at a very interesting briefing recently on C40, which is the network of cities that's kind of organizing itself to engage on climate change. They're up to 80 cities or something now, but they still go by the name of C40. And the person who's making the presentation said that the problem, that the reason for C40 is that when a city, let's say Mexico City, comes along and they're retooling their water infrastructure, or they're doing some kind of upgrade to transportation or something, and they'd like to do it in a climate smart and resilient and more adaptive way, because they do see the problem, and they approach a company, let's say Honeywell or something. This is not a comment about Honeywell. There's lots of companies that do these. It's a company you've heard of, so I use that name. The scale of the market in Mexico City is not big enough to really get Honeywell interested in the kind of innovative, command and control kinds of systems and pushing the technological envelope to really do what Mexico City would like it to do. And so C40, one of the things that it does is it tries to get Sao Paulo and Mexico City and Tokyo and Mumbai and whomever is in that, to kind of coordinate their dialogue with the larger companies. And that's a really challenging thing to do under the current kind of investment regime that we have. And so as we sort of roll out a lot of these new and interesting instruments and new institutional arrangements and new regulatory strategies and so on, dealing with that infrastructure bias, dealing with the scale bias, and dealing with the what I'll just call the C40 market failure problem, it seems to me those are kind of three key linchpins to more robust approaches to climate finance. On the immediacy question, Brent, was it, from NOAA? Frank, I'm sorry. I got 2 names out of 3, so that's good. An interesting example was the Secretary General's Sahel Initiative, which led to some very partly driven by, but also led to some very interesting research that was done on a regional scale with the full participation of all of the states in the region that tried to overlay climate data, spatially distributed climate data, mostly water, because Sherry's absolutely right about water is really the delivery mechanism of climate change, overlay water, mobility, not just migration, because the mobility is an adaptive strategy, and sometimes it's coming and going, sometimes it's nomadic, sometimes it's point-to-point in a more permanent sense, which we think of as migration, but mobility is maybe a better term, and then all sorts of manifestations of conflict. And they were able to show not this sort of lurid picture of environmental refugees that we sometimes get, but clearly changes in water availability were changing the kinds of mobility strategies that people would use. They'd go further, they'd go longer, they'd shift more southward, and so on, in ways that could be associated with increased instances of violent conflict. Not in a strict causal sense, because we can't do that. We don't have the data, we don't have the tools to show that strict causality, and we shouldn't let that hang us up on thinking about risk management and so on. All of that was triggered by Mali and the concerns around terrorism, and again that very short-term immediacy kind of problem that we're trying to we're all saying we need to get around. Sometimes those are opportunities to do some better thinking, some longer-term thinking, some wider scale kind of thinking, and I think in that case it was, and so it is a problem, but sometimes those problems create opportunities at the same time.
Great. Thank you very much, Ken. So as I think about our discussion this morning, I sort of have three key buckets that I reflect on. The first is, as we think about these new risks, are we looking at new risks in all systems? So we talked about that in terms of ability to respond at a national level. We talked about that in terms of the Security Council and ways that the council can be revitalized. We talked about global processes, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals. We had questions about post-Paris, how do you take this down to a country level, a national level? What does it mean for assessment at that level? What does it mean in terms of support systems at that scale? And what does it mean for financing for climate change risks? So there was a general set of discussions around these risks in all systems. The second point for me was the question around how do we communicate consequences and how does that enable action? We talked about that in terms of timeframes for decision making. We talked about assessments. We talked about moving beyond directives. How do we help establish priorities for action when there are competing demands in the conflict space? And how do we move to public opinion and use that as a lever? So I think we had several comments around that. And finally, I think we had a series of thoughts and discussions around the social contract for climate. What's the social contract for climate? What does that mean from a rights perspective? What does it mean in terms of capacity building post-Paris and beyond? What does it mean in terms of looking at responsibility for climate impacts? What does it mean for financing? What does it mean for collaboration and trust building across diplomacy, development, and defense? And how do we use that as a basis to build cooperation? So I sort of think about our discussion this morning in those three buckets. So I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking Nick, Sherry, and Ken for helping us think more about this. Thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge my colleague Lauren Hertzerisi, who helps pull these sessions together, and Skylar Null, Benjamin Dills, Francesca, she left the room, she's hiding there. But you know, these sessions are very much a team effort, so thank you to my colleagues. And I'd invite you to look at the recording of today's discussion and to also be checking our new securitybeat.org blog platform as we continue these discussions and write up the points that we discuss and continue to engage research in this area. So thank you very much, and good Friday, keep dry, and have a great weekend.